This is Stanley Scism on our next episode, link, connection in the study of the book of Genesis. We are starting this time on Genesis 9 verse 7. 9 verse 8. We finished 9 verse 7 on the last lesson. God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark. With you, every living creature on earth, I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be cut off by waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. Now, this is the famous Noah's covenant. There was a covenant with Adam in which God said, I'm putting you in charge of this garden, and you don't eat the fruit from that tree, but you eat the fruit from all the other trees. You're in charge, but you also are responsible to take care of this. So mankind became caretakers, stewards, managers of the garden for God. God delegated some of his power. God had named the different things that he created in Genesis chapter 1. And then when he put Adam in the garden, and Adam began to name the creatures, or if you want to say that it's not a proper noun, and that it's the man, the man began to name the animals. Now, this was the covenant with Noah. And then, of course, that covenant, in one sense, ended because they broke the covenant. They did not keep the covenant, and so they got thrown out of the garden. So an era of innocence. Some people call it a dispensation, but I think to keep this more biblical and strict to the text, it would be better to say covenant, agreement. Now, a covenant between equals can be negotiated, but a covenant with God cannot be negotiated. God is not our equal, so God states what the covenant is that he offers. And then we do have a choice. We can choose to accept the covenant or not accept the covenant. And if we choose not to accept the covenant, of course, that carries consequences with that. Just like today, if a small power would accept a treaty with a major power, that major power is protecting it, but again, maybe exercising some vassalage authority over it. This was true, of course, in the medieval era, but it's true now as well in real politics. But when God establishes a covenant, you have a God who is, first of all-knowing, so you can't deceive him. You have a God who is all-powerful, so you cannot buck his power and rebel against him successfully. You have a God who is also loving and compassionate. And so his anger lasts for a moment, but his generation for a lifetime, and his love for a lifetime. So God says, now I'm giving you this covenant, and these people have just experienced the destruction of the human race of people who did not establish this covenant. Now, there is a whole nother subject here about what the culture was like previous to the flood. And of course, these people will remember that, and they will carry that memory, and how faithful they are to this new covenant will impact how much of the old memory is carried with them, by them, into the new civilization that postdates the flood. So that is a major subject as to how much of the old culture, the old sin, the old world that they lived in, the old way of thinking, how much of that carries over into the new life that they now have. This is what God offers. He says, I will not send another flood. Now, as you read, of course, later in the book of the Bible, you will see that eventually the world is going to end with fire. This is not, of course, only in the book of Revelation, in which, but Peter also mentioned that apparently Jesus taught about this, and they knew it was going to happen. It wasn't just not one stone will be left on another. That was fulfilled in 70 AD by the destruction of Jerusalem, because Jesus said, because you did not accept the time of your visitation, this will happen to you. And of course it did. And so, but it's beyond that. We're talking about the world being dissolved. Peter says that the elements will be dissolved and everything will melt in a fervent heat. Times past, of course, people would say only God could do that. Now human beings have advanced to the state where human beings can destroy, can burn the earth, melt the flesh, melt off their faces. Happened at Hiroshima. It can happen now. Human beings have the ability to destroy the human race by themselves without God's participation. But God says, I will not destroy the human being by flood again. When you put this, knowing that someday there will be fire, and this time it was flood, it brings to mind Robert Frost's poem, some say the world will end in fire, others say in ice. Now I'm paraphrasing here. From what I've seen of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But what I've seen of hate, says ice, is also great and would suffice. But not just fire as a metaphor for anger and desire, and not just ice as a metaphor for cold hatred, but real water and ice, real fire as a literal fire is what we're talking about here. And God says, I will not destroy the earth with a flood again. And when he says this, he gives the sign. And he says, and here is the sign. Now the covenants had signs, and you will see this again in further covenants that happen after this. There will be the Abrahamic covenant with the sign of circumcision, the Davidic covenant with the sign of the dynasty of David's house ruling Israel, the new covenant of grace with Jesus dying on the cross and baptism as our participation in that, and so on. So there are these other covenants that take place also. You must also be aware, we must all also be aware, that more than one covenant can be active at the same time. For example, there are people, when Abraham's covenant comes along, who know about that covenant. That covenant is not with the entire human race, it's with Abraham and his descendants. So how about the rest of the human race? What covenant are they under? They're still under this one, Noah's covenant, because no covenant has succeeded this one for them. And so here, this covenant is with the entire creation. And this is operative for everything and everyone until, in their experience and in their knowledge, they come in line and touch with a succeeding covenant. God says, this is the sign of the covenant I'm making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds. Does this mean there never was a rainbow ever before? No, not necessarily. Just like when God sets up circumcision as a sign of the Abrahamic covenant. Circumcision existed before. We have evidence before Abraham's life of circumcision existing previous to that. But God took something that was already there and said, now I'm making this a sign of my covenant with you. God frequently takes things that are familiar to people and uses it as a symbol of something that he wants to, and this is God used Esther. Esther's name comes from Ishtar. Ishtar is a pagan goddess, but God uses this girl, this young lady, with this name, and he makes her a symbol of his authority, and through him, his protection, and through her intercession, her involvement with the king, of this protection for his people. So, did Ishtar exist? Of course, Ishtar as a goddess existed before, but God used this woman named after that goddess to as for his own purposes. And baptism, the Jews had many washings of different washings and ceremonies. And not only that, of course, you may recall that some of Jesus' disciples were censured by the Jews because they didn't follow the washings and ceremonies. And in the biography and the gospel, the explanation goes forward to the reader to explain that the Jews have all these washing ceremonies because that reader, that audience, isn't aware of that possibly and has to be given that background information. But John the Baptist was baptizing people before Jesus' disciples were. And so baptism, see, already existed. But then Jesus took it and they were baptized, his disciples baptized by Jesus' authority. And so that's another example, you see, of a sign existing previously, but then that action, that deed, that symbol being adopted by God for his own covenant to use it as a symbol. And since he's the creator, yeah, he can adopt it and use anything he wants. It's his world. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So God has every right to use whatever he has made as a symbol of his covenant. So then he says, I've set my rainbow in the sky, and this will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Okay, the whole earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and a rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind, and never again will waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember. And the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on earth. This is the sign of the covenant I've established between me and all life on earth. So now notice the repetition. Things are said 2 or 3 times. Now, there were some people who came along and said, what has happened here is that there are these different threads or strains of thought that existed. They called it the J text, which was for the use of Yahweh, and they said that's one set of writings. Now, again, they did not necessarily say that this was one writer, but one group, one school of thought, one group of writers. Secondly, they said there was the Elohistic one, the one who said Elohim, and that was another group. And then it was also theorized that the Yahvistic one was from the southern kingdom and the Elohistic one was from the northern kingdom. And then there was the P thought, P for priestly. And they thought this is the one who comes in and adds to the preceding writings his emphasis on genealogies, priestly ritual, and so on. So they said this is a third one. And then they thought this may be one person who is writing this. Some people thought it would be someone in Ezra's time, something like that. And then fourth, there was the Deuteronomistic school that some people thought. Now, these are theories. These are speculations. These are people wondering about this and that, like Solomon and Ecclesiastes. And that's, but there is no proof of this documentary thesis in the sense of there is no previous documents have been found of these speculated books from which the text is written. If, of course, it's quite possible that different documents existed, but note that the person who did the redacting, the person who compiled it together, perhaps with thoughts of his own, did not edit this down to eliminate repetition. There's a lot of repetition, and whoever is doing this editing respects the text so much that he will not tamper with it. He will not take away from the text. He will not subtract from the text, because he even when there's monotonous repetition involved, And so that is a fascinating position to take for someone who supposedly is engineering his own text. You can see that there is an attitude that what he's dealing with is sacred and he must not tamper with it. The next thing, the sons of Noah, this is verse 18, the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, this listing of these three, elsewhere we find that Japheth is the oldest. So why is he listed last? And we find out elsewhere also that Ham is the youngest. Why is he in the middle? So we will look at this in our next lesson also.